thing that people get more wrong is to confuse rigidity with faithfulness. And that's why the title of my book is Rigidity, Faithfulness, or Heterodoxy. Because I noticed a pattern, which is Pope Francis is very keen on criticizing rigidity. It's a hallmark of his pontificate. And whenever he does so, people will just come out into social media and complain that why is Pope Francis always criticizing faithful Catholics? The faithful Catholics are always being criticized, and this shows a subtle analogy here, or a subtle comparison, which is these people, when they say Pope Francis criticizes rigidity, he is criticizing faithful Catholics, they are equating rigidity with faithfulness. And this cannot be. Pope Francis says that rigidity is something that we must avoid. And obviously, Pope Francis is not criticizing faithful Catholics. He
Yeah.
wants us to be even more faithful precisely by eschewing rigidity. And so my idea was to try to refute this idea that is so ingrained. In my previous book, Heresy Disguised Tradition, I tried to refute another ingrained idea, which was I can disregard the magisterium if it goes against my personal idea of tradition. And now I'll try to refute another ingrained idea, which is if Pope Francis criticizes rigidity, he is criticizing faithful Catholics. And these ideas are so ingrained that people who verbalize these ideas, who talk about these ideas, they don't even stop to think whether those ideas are true or not. They just assume that they are true. And I'm trying to be a bit thought provoking and try to make them reassess those positions which they hold so dogmatically. No, Pope Francis is not criticizing faithful Catholics. Pope Francis is criticizing rigidity so that we become more faithful. And I I tried to show that in the past many people were rigid, were not faithful. In fact, they
Yeah.
became heretics.
Hmm. Gosh, honestly, it's another one of those amazing books. I am so glad to have read it. So as I mentioned to you earlier, I read through it over about 2 days, and I remember thinking as I was opening it, like, I know it's going to be good because Pedro wrote it, and I enjoyed your previous one. But I had an initial sense of like, oh boy, this is going to be heavy. It's going to be dense. It's going to be very Thomistic, But it isn't. It's very easy to read. It's full of these little examples, and I confess I got like halfway through. I think you were talking about either the history of. Okay, here's what I loved about this book: the clarity that you bring to these two concepts, rigorism and then laxism, and both sides accuse each other of being like horrible, and that they're the appropriate faithful sense of the other side is heterodox. And I loved how you charted these two mindsets throughout the history of the church. So it's a phenomenal overview of what the church has tried to navigate, and in preserving the genius and the charism of the gospel, whatever the right word is, without losing itself in one or the other. And the stories that you have shared and the way that you've written them, the way that you've shared them, they're so easy to read. They're so fast paced, and there's so much drama in them. And I know that you enjoy kind of writing yourself, and so you've done such a great job with those. I got to the end and I thought, this is another book I wish I'd read as a teenager in high school. This would have been just so easy to read and so very, very helpful. So let's go back and talk about with rigidity. Let's say it's got a dark side, right? We assume you open the first chapter is so good on this. With we assume that the harder we double down on following the rules, and the more hard-headed we are, and everybody looks at us for being just uncompromising with things, so being rigid, like the Holy Father says. We wear that as a badge of honor. We take that as a point of pride, because it is very hard to follow the rules, and look at me accomplishing this. Therefore, well, the truth must be with me, and I must be righteous and a good person, or something like that. And then you go on to show this is actually this is a dark side. It's a temptation
Mhm.
that rigidity can lead us to, no matter who you are. It doesn't have to be just traditionalists. It can be, well, honestly, it's anybody around the world. Go into that a little bit more because why this division between rigidity and laxity? Isn't laxity the answer to being so hard-headed about following the rules?
No, what I tried to write right off the bat on the first chapter was because people who read this will probably think, oh, this guy is advocating laxism because he is going against rigidity. And that's also what they think Pope Francis is advocating. He's advocating laxism. But what I wanted to say is that what I'm promoting is not laxism at all, but uh, these people who feel accused by Pope Francis when he speaks of rigidity because they think that's faithfulness, they have an incomplete perspective of the faith, not an incorrect one, or rather, it's only incorrect insofar as it's incomplete and it only shows a partial view.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of Manichaean. There's the good side and the bad side, the evil and the good. And so, if laxism is bad, which it is, then what is not laxism is good, and so rigidity is good. But
It's a false
this
dichotomy.
is very simplistic.
Okay.
And what I try to show is that the virtue ethics, the traditional Catholic virtue ethics, is not Manichaean, and it's not evil versus good in this dualistic fashion. Yes, evil exists, but evil is not on one side. Actually, evil is in two sides. And the virtue is in the middle,
Mm-hmm.
trying to find a golden mean between two extremes. And what we notice if we study the history of the church and the history of heresies is that they usually come in pairs because people find that this extreme is erroneous, so they try to overcorrect and they think, oh, if I go to the opposite side of this error, I will be protected. But I am not. I am not protected. I'm going to fall into the opposite error. And that's why being Catholic is hard, not only because you have to follow the rules, but because you have to have discernment and you have to have virtue. And the virtue, among the virtues, one of the virtues is prudence, which is how your reason is attuned to reality. And reality is complex. And it's very simple, very easy to think, well, if I always do this, if I only act like this, I will be protected. We want simple answers. So if laxism is bad, if I'm rigid, I'll always be good. So I always should go to the rigid course of action. But that's not being human, that's being like a robot. And it's not prudent because that's not reality. Reality is to have discernment, and to have discernment is to be rigid when I need to be rigid and flexible when I need to be flexible. It's not always being flexible. If I'm always being flexible and
Yeah.
always choosing being flexible because being flexible is always the right course of action, that's also a kind of rigidity too.
Mm-hmm.
So rigidity is not, when we say that we should not be rigid, it's not about going to the into field of laxism. Is to not always search the same answers to a reality that is complex, but
Mm-hmm.
exercise discernment so that we are attuned to our reality. Virtue is the ability to being inclined towards what is good, and we need to know what is good at all times. And so we must be, it's if it's good to be rigid in this circumstance, and Pope Francis has said there is a good rigidity because there is. We must be uncompromising on virtue.
Mm-hmm.
There is no excess of virtue, but an excess of something that when it is on a golden mean is virtue, that excess is a vice, just
Mhm.
like the lack is a vice.
Mhm. I that right there was a phenomenal first chapter. Even, what if you just get the Kindle preview? I mean, you can actually borrow the whole thing on Kindle. But even if you just get that first chapter and just read that, it's such a phenomenal reframing of, like you say, it's an unjust, it's an inappropriate dualism or dichotomy between nothing and everything. It's like, no, actually the virtue is the balancing of these excesses. What I also loved about the book is the consistent grounding in everything the Holy Father has had to say about this topic. And it's just routinely, I don't know what you want to say, cathartic and encouraging, beautiful, and it's troubling and all of this. And so it's a wonderful book to have on your shelf if you want to understand where he's coming from. And honestly, what the book, what your book has done in pulling together everything the Holy Father has to say on this topic, it's a bit of a, it's like attending a retreat on a mode of spiritual direction. And then you go and you back it up with a whole ton of history and examples and so on. But at its core, it's trying to help us understand, what does the Holy Father have to say? What does he think about this topic? And why does it still matter the same way it has mattered for every human in the last, 2000 years of our history? So now I've got to ask, for wrapping of this episode, why you and why this topic? Why does it matter for you so much that you went and wrote a book on it?
Well, I really uh, don't know how to answer that. It's just that I felt like I had to write it because that was an insight that came to me, and I thought it's not being covered as far as I know. So
Mhm.
I found this pattern, so I'll just go along and write it. If God willing, it will provide fruit, give fruit. So uh, all I know is that I felt like this needed to be covered. I
Mhm.
didn't see it being covered, just like the heresy discussed tradition. Orthodoxy of Amoris Laetitia, another book of mine, was already being kind of covered, but did not have so wider a coverage. So yeah, I believe that I felt like I had to write it, and I had a lot of fun writing it. It's also a proof that I think I was doing well because I was happy doing it. It's exactly what I also write in the book. It's the freedom of the children of God. It's not about being a slave to the law, but doing something that is good because it fulfills your soul. It gives you joy, and you feel like you just have to do it. So uh, that was it. There's no other answer. I What matters the most is now that it comes into the world, and hopefully it will bear fruit, because Pope Francis has such important insights, and they are all being smothered under these layers of hostility and
Yeah.
fake news. And they even say that Pope Francis is a materialist or an atheist. He doesn't speak of Jesus. And many of these talks about rigidity actually come from his morning meditations that are so spiritually rich. And it's such a shame when I read them, it's such a shame that all this wisdom is being thrown away, not reaching a wider audience because everyone is criticizing him so heavily. It needs to come out. It needs to come out. And that's precisely what I try to do. I went into the Vatican website. I did a search on the search bar for the word rigidity. I filtered only for Pope Francis, and I saw 100 plus hits. So I tried reading as many as I could to try to find the patterns, what Pope Francis, if there was context that would repeat over the course of different talks and different interventions. And when I found out those patterns, I also found out that those patterns fit temptations that are not new. They are not new. And so, with Heresy Disguised Tradition, I had already made a review of the history of the church to see if the heresies of the past fitted those molds. And then I thought, well, there have been many rigid heresies in the past,
Mhm.
many rigid heresies. So might as well also learn from them. And with Pope Francis, we see that there's nothing new under the sun. These temptations exist since the beginning of the church because they are part of the imperfection of the human soul. There's nothing new under the sun because the human soul is always the same. So the temptations, the externals, the names of the ideologies, the gimmicks might be different, but at the core, it's always the same because the human heart is always the same. And it's always deceived the same way.
So, friends, go ahead and check out the link in the description to buy a copy. We're going to come back for part 2 of this 3-part series with Pedro. Pedro, where can folk find you online to learn more about you and this book?
So people can search rigidity, faithfulness, or heterodoxy in Amazon. It's in English. People who also speak Portuguese, which is my native language, can also find it in Amazon.es. That's the Spanish Amazon, but it's easy to find the shipping to Portugal, or Amazon.com.br for Brazilians. Um, and at this moment it's in Amazon that you can find it. It's published by Unroute Books and Media, and hopefully let's see if in the future it might have other means of distribution, but for now it's through Amazon.
So, check the links in the description, friends, and we will be back with another part 2 very soon.